welcome everybody to this panel. Lots of planets have a south. We are going to be diving into this notion of the construct of global souths throughout science fiction and fantasy and constructed worlds. We've got a host of different perspectives from across the globe, and I'm going to have each of them introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with the conversation. So let's start with Anna, and then we'll go to Manish, and then Robert and Carl. So Anna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Kashina. I am a fantasy author. So I write secondary world fantasies, which means I do world building for each of my novels or novel series. And so geography is kind of very important on my list. I'm originally from Russia, so I grew up in Russia. And so the concept of North and South and East and West in Russian science fiction is slightly different from Western. So I was kind of look forward to discussing this topic. And also in my day job, I'm a biomedical scientist. So sometimes I also appear on panels in this capacity, but not today. So,
thank you, Anna. Manish?
Hi, everyone. My name is Manish Malwani. I'm a science fiction and horror writer from Singapore. I've been based in the US for the last 10 or so years, although I'm currently back in Singapore for a little bit. I am very interested in sort of the hollowed out corpse of empire or the rot at empire's heart. And I've done a little bit of theoretical or academic science fiction work as well. My master's thesis was about the imperial gaze in science fiction and fantasy and how the craft of world building is kind of insidiously or perniciously infected with a colonial or imperial perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert?
Hi there, Robert Reddick. I tend to get so fascinated by hearing other people's little bio intros that I forget my own, but I'm an epic fantasy writer, and I'm right in the middle of my second series. Book 2 called Sidewinders just came out about a month ago. And I have also worked on and off for many a year in international development and poverty alleviation. And that's sort of I guess calling it a parallel career might be an overstatement because it was so on again and off again. But I've also lived abroad quite a bit, although I grew up in Iowa and Virginia and now live in the Northeast in Massachusetts.
Awesome. Carl?
Hi, I'm Carl Schrader. I'm Canadian. This is my most recent novel, Stealing Worlds, which is set in Ohio. Being Canadian means sleeping next to the elephant. So we always have a fraught relationship with our southern neighbor, but are also often identified with it, which creates an interesting tension. I'm very interested in post-colonial utopias, which is the kind of thing that I'm writing right now.
Very cool.
Also often identified.
And I'm David Bowles. I'm a Mexican-American writer of science fiction and fantasy for young people and adults. I live in South Texas and in Mexico. I'm also a translator and a scholar of Nahuatl, which is an indigenous language from Mexico. And a lot of the work that I do is an attempt to push back against the colonial mindset that is perpetuated in Latin America and to recenter indigenous ways of being in speculative fiction. So this is definitely a topic that's near and dear to my heart. Okay, so let's jump in. Manish, you posited that what authors, especially Western Anglophone ones, absorb about the divisions between the global North and global South is deeply subconscious. And most people, you say, don't consider the scale of the Gulf, the violence of the borders and regimes enacted to protect that Gulf, or the fact that, frankly, most of us are deeply implicated in the perpetuation of that violent Gulf. So let's all think about this and chat about it in any way you want to. What do authors absorb from living in a world divided conceptually and stereotypically into a wealthier, healthier North and a poorer, struggling South? How do we absorb that and perhaps like what does that do within us before it even reaches our work, I guess? although we can begin to touch on that as well. Who wants to start us off? Anybody, or should we go in a particular order? I didn't think about asking that.
Well, I can start off. There's a parallel structure to the North-South divide within the colonized nations of the North. And in Canada, we have the wealthy urban white South and the impoverished non-white North. We're just coming to terms with this. I just learned a few months ago that in my hometown of Brandon, Manitoba, when I was growing up, there was a residential school in which children who had been ripped away from their parents were taken to be educated in English and brought up as good imitation white Canadians. There's a wonderful musical project called Secret Path by the late Gordon Downey, about a young boy trying to run away from one of these. And thousands did and thousands died. And I never knew growing up. To find out that this institution existed somewhere in my hometown as I was innocently going about my childhood has been deeply, deeply wrenching and upsetting. And as a country, we're just finally coming to terms with this. So yes, there is the North-South division, and for instance, Canadian mining companies are implicated in terrible acts all around the world. But even within our countries, these divisions exist.
Who wants to jump in next?
So yeah, I'll jump in. So as a kind of, so I had this background because I changed hemispheres in my life and I changed cultures. So when I grew up, I was in Russia and I was reading like both Russian and Western science fiction and fantasy. And yeah, you kind of, so you naturally assume this geography, which resembles the geography of your own country. So yeah, it's kind of natural. Yeah, people live in the North. So at the same time, when you read Westerns, I read like fantasy from America, so East is always bad. So like, for example, Tolkien, yeah, Lord of the Rings is one of the books I grew up reading. So it's kind of natural, yeah, all the evil comes from the East. And to me, it's like, what do you mean? It comes from the West. We all know that. So like this world is turned around. So it was kind of a very interesting divide. And I think, so it's very deeply, so when people read about it from certain culture and start writing, sometimes they just don't think about those things. So like this position of the world is very natural. So you grow up on this. So it takes kind of some extra thought or some extra background to break out of this. And for example, so I like to write historical fantasy. So the deeper in history you go, the more it is south is the wealthy parts. So civilization started in the south. And then like northern barbarians came and conquered them. So then later on civilization centers moved to the north, not because Norse people or people in the north developed those things, but because they took them like with arms in their hands and conquered and killed all the South people who invented it. So I think because I've written a lot of historical fantasy and I also do a lot of research all the way to the ancient civilizations when I create my worlds, it kind of became like very, so you have a very sharp sense, like if you're talking like North versus South, like when are you talking about? And in the worlds which I write about, it's invariably South is actually kind of better developed than the North, because North is the source of barbarians who came and killed everybody basically. So, and I think this perspective, but so if you read different books, you kind of, another thing I did when I changed hemispheres, I learned to put myself into different sets of minds. So in this set of mind, this is kind of natural, but at the same time, you have this perspective that, yeah, there's something behind it. And I think kind of realizing all these perspectives enriches both the reading and the writing. And I think it's good if the authors remember this when they write their novels and create their worlds.
That's really fascinating because it feels like a double indictment of the North then, because if if the North, in its barbaric stage, invaded the global South and stole, the technology and knowledge, and then went back to the North and developed into, empires, and then conquered the South. It's like this, like the cycle of conquest, and hopefully the South will be ascendant again. The global South will be ascendant again, and I think that is what a lot of
I
science.
guess it depends on the climate change right now. But
Yeah, yeah. If it triggers an ice age, that could, the North could be obliterated. You want to jump in, Manish?
Sure. So I think the thing I was thinking about a lot was the obscuration of these uneven power relations and the history of colonialism, the webs of extraction over centuries that have created this wealthier, healthier North and quote unquote poorer, struggling South. And I think there's a way in which maybe what is unconsciously absorbed by a lot of people, especially in the global North, is a kind of almost like magical thinking that this is the way things are, this is the natural order of things, without thinking about, oh, there's actually like a whole web of history and policy decisions that are like actively perpetuating this setup. There's a quote from Henry Kissinger where he says, nothing important can come from the South. And of course, Henry Kissinger, famously spent his entire life perpetuating this exact pattern of exploitation. So yeah, I guess I'm really interested in how, science fiction or world building maybe can begin to not take these geographical differences at face value, because we shouldn't, because they're actually the result of, very material choices and kind of like predatory, uneven relationships. And I guess the last thing I wanted to say, just being from Singapore, is I think even though we are sort of on the equator pretty much, we are technically in the South, but I wouldn't say that we are actually part of the global South. I think we very self-consciously and, from the 1970s on, turned our back on the Third World Project and the global South and kind of allied more with the global North. And I think I and other people from Singapore are very much implicated in the exploitation of our regional neighbors.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Robert?
Gosh, my head is spinning with a lot of things already. I guess a starting point for me in trying to think about this topic is I think about my own struggle as both a writer and a reader, but just to say as a writer for the moment, it's kind of to balance the firm belief I have that good fiction is about individuals and it's about making individuals more visible and more alive for us with each page, I guess. And at the same time, my respect and kind of lifelong interest in looking at things that we have to think about in a not in an individualistic way, but in an extremely nuanced and large scale way. So when I think about the concept of the global South, those two kind of tensions come to mind pretty quickly. On the one hand, I feel like when you're sitting in a privileged position like I have virtually all my life in the West, in so many categories of identity, put me in a position of comfort and relative safety. And you look out at other people in other situations, there's a temptation to start trying to quickly come up with stable categories so that you can just order your thinking and move on, and so when you apply that to people in, when we talk about the global South, I think the notion that tends to come to mind is that we're talking about a zone of marginalization, of sort of eclipsed opportunities, of poverty and so on. We make those sort of starting assumptions if, as Manish says, if we don't carefully interrogate them from the outset. But to sort of impose that identity on anyone is to really risk doing great harm to them. I mean, you go to someone in the Dadaab refugee complex in northern Kenya and ask them who they are, they may immediately say, I'm a refugee. They might not, but either way, they're not going to want to stop there. They're sure as hell not going to want to stop there and say, that's all I am. And whether our imagination stops there or not, whether our patience extends any further or not, there's so much more than that. You know, some of those people have graduate degrees. Some of those people can set a limb or deliver a baby, or, you know, intubate somebody who's in respiratory distress. Some of them write beautifully, but all of them are individuals who don't have any interest in being deadened down into a category. And, you know, so when I talk about this tension, I mean, on the one hand, sitting in the West, I don't want to in any way deny the culpability in the history and the ongoing exploitation of peoples that is so systemic and structural. And on the other hand, as a writer, I don't want to reduce anyone to playing that role of victim, of simplistic. And so the balancing for me is just, you know, giving both to the reader as acceptably and as accessibly as I can. Hope that makes some sense.
Yeah, it sure does. And I mean, I think that this is, you know, some crucial points have been made about the way historical trends and a lot of those historical trends having to do with mercantilism and capitalism, and the way people from like northern, frankly, more impoverished in terms of natural resources and culture and stuff like that areas have hit upon this idea that Manish has talked about, that you know, you gain prosperity, like, you know, like there's a pie with that never grows, and you gain prosperity by dominating that pie. You dominate groups of people. You have, you know, hundreds or thousands or millions of people working to provide for the economic security and well-being of a very small number of, you know, empire builders. And that mindset that's the way things just have to be is definitely, it feels to be definitely like a northern mercantilist capitalist kind of imperial mentality. Although, you know, other societies outside of the northern hemisphere have engaged in that kind of stuff. It definitely feels more of a trend of that. And I think about, like, for example, towns where I live on the border with Mexico, with this, first it was the territory of the Coahuiltecans, and then was, you know, conquered by New Spain and became ranching country for many hundreds of years, first under New Spain and then under Mexico, before, you know, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo pushed the border south of, from the Pecos River down to the Rio Grande. And white people started coming in towards the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century and buying up this ranch land, often at like really ridiculous prices, or, you know, through tricking people or through legal wrangling or whatever, disputing Spanish land grants and things like that, until they had enough land to establish towns. And when they built these towns, they pushed the Mexican Americans who had been working on the ranches to the south of the railroad tracks. And this is a very typical thing in the US, that the south side of town, south of the railroad tracks, is where, you know, the people, you know, whether they're Black or Mexican American or impoverished or whatever, where they tend to live. So we repeat these patterns again and again, and it's not until, you know, we force ourselves to break free from that we begin to imagine a different sort of world. And so I'm just curious, maybe we could just like quickly go around. Some of you've already touched on this. You know, it's clear that, you know, people from the global north might be lulled into thinking this way, or be accustomed to thinking this way, or benefit from thinking this way. But what about people from the global south, whether they're in a diaspora or living in the global south? You know, Manish brings up the example of Singapore, and that kind of pattern you see repeated in cities and nations throughout the global south, where people align with the north and colonialism and capitalism, to maybe their own personal benefit, but to the detriment of the rest of the global south. So what do you guys think about that? In what way are people from the global south sometimes self-colonized in that way?
Well, I think that definitely, yeah, there's this attitude that exists. So this attitude is two-sided, and I've seen it And it's not, I mean, so geographic is complicated division because yeah, we can talk about China, which is not really South. And then we can talk about Australia, which is definitely South, but it's not really aligning with the global South as we're talking about it. But I think, yeah, people tend to feel inferior just because they're not, so by and large, they want to be more like Northern people. They want to identify with the North, and it kind of somehow propagates. And I would say like we as writers have a huge responsibility in it. So people grow up like reading fiction where like people from the North are the good guys and better and more educated and, you know, more capable. And it just, it's a problem attitude, which I think needs to change. But so it's like people kind of lose the pride in who they are. And I think, yeah, it's, and this definitely feeds this. So, I mean, yeah, so if we try to feed them the stereotypes, it's natural. So it's natural to kind of to the writers from the North to write this way. It's natural to people from the South to feel this way. So yeah, and I think there's a lot of biological roots in it. A lot of it is hardwired into our brain, but I kind of, I would love to see this change. And it's not, like I said, so I keep bringing in East and West because it's not strictly about the South, even though, yeah, South is a good way to describe it, but yeah.
Well, there's a really good example, concrete example of this in during the Cold War, where there was two Northern narratives being pushed on people in the South, the narrative of communism and the narrative of capitalism. And one country, Chile, had some of the most sophisticated research in systems theory going on anywhere. Maturana and Varela invented a lot of our modern ideas about systems. And in 1970, 1969, 1970, Chile voted in a government that was nominally socialist, but defined itself as going a third way, quite explicitly, using cybernetics and new systems thinking. And it was immediately defined as a communist beachhead, particularly in the United States. And in 1973, well, September 11th, 1973, it was that government was destroyed by the CIA-backed coup, and 30,000 people immediately killed. So it's a case where that shows that when you have global hegemony from the North, people in the South, it's not so much that they willingly define themselves in the terms provided by the North, but if they try and define themselves in any other way, they will often be destroyed. And this has been the historical sort of ground truth up until this point.
Anybody else want to?
Well, just briefly, my wife is from Mumbai, came west when she was 18. And she, in telling the story of her family and their sort of outlook on life and where they were all headed, their trajectory, she talks about what I think you could succinctly call self-colonization a lot. She talks about the idolization of all things Western and the denigration of all things Indian in their own minds, because they had identified as a family and as a sort of a subgroup within Mumbai of with what they called modernization. And so anything that smacked of tradition, she was taught at an early age to just despise. And anything that was in the West, she was taught and became predisposed to think was fantastic. And so when she came here and saw all the ways that the West is a mess, that the West is unjust, that the West is doing things poorly, it was a terribly disillusioning moment. And I just always think about that. I mean, there's another comment really briefly back to your original subject, David, is I think one of the great services that speculative fiction has always done with regard to thinking about these things is allowing us to sort of shatter and break up the physical ideas we have of where all this occurs, you know, where the center is, where the periphery is, and so on. And, you know, where the nerve center of power and the nerve center of empire is, and where the periphery is, because it's so often set in an imagined context. And I mean, you probably know the literature 100 times better than me, but in Latin America, for example, so many things that couldn't be said back to power were said through an imaginative lens, by just setting things in a fantastic setting, you know, or attributing a fantastic cause to something that was, you know, clear to most readers was a reflection of state power or some aspect of authority that couldn't be openly questioned.
Sure, definitely a lot of magical realism was kind of engineered to be covert, you know, political speech. Yeah. Manish, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, I resonate a lot with what you said, Robert, from your wife's perspective. And yeah, I could probably go on for hours about like self-colonization, but I think to put it like succinctly, it really goes deep into the soul. You know, it's sort of at such a deep level of the mind and the heart that, you know, I'm continually noticing things where I'm like, oh, that is clearly some like post-colonial internalized nonsense that I'm trying to unlearn. And I think it is a long-term project, and I think that is why I write. You know, my granddad was born a subject of the British Empire. Like he remembers like when the Japanese invaded and conquered Singapore in the Second World War. Like he remembers, he's told me like the visceral feeling he had of seeing white prisoners of war sweeping the streets, and how that felt. It completely changed something inside of him to see that. And, you know, that's only 2 generations ago. So I think like internal colonization is very much still a thing that people born today still experience. They still get it from, you know, ongoing media representations. I think it's going to take like 5-6 generations to really purge it. And I feel like science fiction and fantasy is a marvelous medium for beginning to, you know, root out internal colonization. One other thing I wanted to say just about like, I guess in response to something Carl was saying about the Cold War and, you know, the 2 North ideological projects, which is just that the Third World Project, you know, the non-aligned movement, was ultimately destroyed by actions from, you know, the First and Second World, but also destroyed by like internal sellouts, essentially. You know, people like me, people with like privileged class positions being like, no, we're going to throw in our lots with the things that's the, you know, the groups that are going to give us power. And so I think that's something to be really important about as well, because naturally, just especially with like Anglophone publishing, English language publishing, it's going to be people like myself with class privilege, people like Salman Rushdie, who are going to get the book deals, who are going to be naturally the most represented in the West. So that's definitely something to be aware of as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, this one of the colorism, for example, is one of the many things that we're grappling with in diaspora representation in Anglophone publishing. You know, one of the books that I'm reminded of in this conversation is Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian educator and philosopher, politician. And in it, he talks about how in a colonial society, you have 2 classes, the oppressor class and the oppressed class. And they're usually different races or ethnicities. And what begins to happen is that people in the oppressed class over time conceive of the world as divided just in those 2 classes. And the oppressor class is the human class, and the oppressed class is something subhuman. And so whenever somebody from the oppressed class gets an opportunity to garner more power and rise above the oppression that they despise, the only example they have of another way of being is the way of being of the oppressed class. And so they become sub-oppressors. And this group of sub-oppressors is something we see, for example, in Mexico, where we're still grappling with the ravages of the Spanish colonial system, the caste system that was implemented, where it's just now that people who are of mixed ancestry are beginning to feel pride in their indigenous roots and to reach out to indigenous communities and lift them up and so forth. And this is happening throughout Latin America, but it's still a really contentious thing. There are plenty of people, middle class people or people who aspire to middle class in Latin American countries that continue to ape this notion of like, I want my children to be lighter skinned and more European looking. I think of my own dad who married a woman who wasn't Mexican American, and how happy, from stories I was told as a kid, his family was that he had married like a light skinned white woman so that his children would be even lighter skinned. There's this saying in Spanish, "I can mejorar la raza." You have to better the race, as if the admixture of Northern European blood somehow is makes things superior. But it's definitely like it boils down to economic benefits within a highly structured capitalist society, where the wider you are, the more access you have to privilege and power and stuff like that. And I mean, and that's something whose vestiges are all over the global South that we have to grapple with. So I guess let's move into talking about works themselves, right? So either science fiction and fantasy from the global South, which is obviously key to this conversation, but also diasporic work that maybe you want to talk about, or Western authors that you think either get this very wrong or get it surprisingly right. So just whatever you want to talk about in terms of like specific works or trends that you're seeing, let's pop around and then we can take some audience questions at that.
Well, something that really I notice is how science fiction, Western science fiction, perpetuates this structure. And there's two reasons to do it. One, because you don't know that you're doing it. And secondly, to educate people. Now, a case I think of where the authors don't know they're doing it is The Expanse, in which we have a solar system civilization in which there's the oppressor class from Earth and the colonized, the Belters. And then there's the ones in the middle, the Martians, who find themselves as an oppressor class too. It's sort of in that middle realm that you talked about of trying to breed up. And that's great if their intention is to make a metaphor for the current world. As a projection of the future, of course, it's a complete failure. Because, I mean, they've never read their Gerard K. O'Neill, obviously, and don't realize that a person living in the belt has just as much resources available to them as a person living on the moon or Mars or anywhere else in the solar system. So the actual solar system does not perpetuate the economic foundation for this kind of colonialism. But The Expanse does, by a whole series of contrivances that that sort of serendipitously result in the repetition of this future. But I think a lot of authors just assume that the future in space will be a capitalist future of giant corporations, of oppression, the little guy, and so on and so forth. And it's the default future for our visions of humanity in space. And that concerns me a lot, because I've always felt that representation is advocacy. And if we are representing that world, in some respect, we are advocating for it.
Not condemning it, not indicting it.
Yeah, you could, but if you aren't deliberately setting out to do that, then yeah, you're saying this is inevitable.
Yeah.
It's terrible. You know, these characters are having an awful life, but this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah, it's kind of because you were talking about this communist versus capitalist and now about the future. So one thing I wanted to mention, so communism in the West is completely like misrepresented. So what Soviet Union stood for wasn't communism. I mean, like what everybody's problem was not communism, it was a dictatorship part.
A dictatorship, yeah.
So
The communism was the problem.
Yeah.
The actual communist society is the society of Star Trek. So Star Trek is like what we were taught in school is the communist future.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, since you mentioned also the future and the corporate future, so here is another reality, which, I mean, is probably like never going to happen, but yeah, because so in some ways, communist ideals go against human nature, and this is why communists fail.
Not necessarily. They may go against current bureaucratic structures.
Fundamental idea of communism is everybody gives what they can and gets what they need. So as it turns out, humans don't work this way. So they don't. Yeah. So they like if you give them what they need, they're not going to give what they can. And I mean, like I think the way like currently the pandemics is handled, which was what we started the conversation with, kind of shows that people don't think of the greater good. They're not going to give what they can. They're just going to take. And this is why fundamentally, and then like people who tried to implicate this communism felt like, yeah, then you need some oppression, you need to tell people what to do. So when I grew up in the Soviet Union, we were living in this transition state to the communist society where people have to get to be forced to do things so that then in the future we can have like communism. And I think it's fundamentally, it's not realizable, unfortunately, but yeah, if it could happen, it would be, I think, great. But, I mean, this is like another way authors portray the future. So, yeah. But I think
the late Soviet. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
There's that that super famous, wonderful late Soviet science fiction novel by the Strugatskys, Roadside Picnic, which I've always wondered what the original Russian is. Does it mean roadside picnic, or was that a Western substitute? Do you know?
Sorry, you mentioned some. I didn't hear.
Do you? Well, that's sorry. That's a detail aside, but you know, I always think about Roadside Picnic by the Strugatskys when I'm thinking about class and speculative fiction. To circle back to your question a little bit, David, and I mean, I guess when I think of the Global South, one of the sort of figurative ways it operates for me is as like a geographical projection of class everywhere. And it's interesting because 2 years ago here in Readercon, there was, to my delight, actually a panel on class specifically. I think it's the first time I've ever seen that. And Malcolm Older was part of it, John Chu, and Kat Valente, I forget who else. But somebody in there, I found my little scribbled notes this morning, somebody said that there is nothing in life, in real life, that class does not permeate, and yet science fiction and fantasy often pretend otherwise. And I think that's one of the things I loved about Roadside Picnic. And I'm so curious, it's in a very particular sort of Soviet expression of this in a way, in that the sense of oppression is everywhere. The presence of the oppressors is always at a distance there, but it's a wonderful story in that it, from the beginning to the end, as you know, an extraterrestrial encounter transforms the Earth in many ways, we stay strictly with a set of people who are unequivocally underclass. They are poor smugglers and bootleggers just trying to get by and survive by hawking anything they can steal and sell out of this strange zone of extraterrestrial contact. And I guess it was a sort of a revelatory book for me in that the heroes are not ruling class members in disguise or ruling class members to be. They never leave their identity like so much fantasy tends to do, where it turns out the poor farm boy stereotype figure that we've encountered a million times is destined to join the monarchy, is destined to become a king or a prince or enter that circle. No, you know, they stay there absolutely all the way through. And there's, for Western readers, I mean, I think that it's wonderful that we never get a moment where we just get to say, oh, good, I knew you were one of us all along. You know, we are, and I think that is something I've subconsciously chosen to do and enacted with my own work, or tried to. I didn't, that wasn't a conscious project, but when I look back on my work, I realized I was trying to imagine characters, main characters, who never, you know, pulled off the disguise and said, see, I'm really Western just like you, and I'm, you know, or now I've made it, and I've you know, as you said, David, I've graduated into that better me, that better identity that's more perhaps familiar and comfortable to a lot of Western readers. But, you know, they, you know, my characters start as people from a small village, and they are going to be that when I'm finally done writing about them. And yet they're fascinating individuals in their own right and can have a great effect on the world.
Yeah, I was actually going to say, so I think I see a lot of shift in modern fantasy and science fiction into this type of fiction. And I think I'm very proud of the field, because it's taking on the questions of diversity and the fact that, yeah, people like don't have to, and it doesn't have to be about privileged people. And like, and I think there are a lot of authors emerging from different backgrounds who really do this well, and who are really kind of, so it's no longer okay to write like about a white farm boy who went on to become a king because he is white. And it used to be like kind of a default fantasy trope. And I think, yeah, so the changes are great. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I hope it continues and goes even better.
Manish?
I'm just like extremely appreciative of that point, and thinking about like, yeah, just how unhelpful the trope of like the elevated, you know, the protagonist who, oh, she's actually like a Skywalker or the descendant of Emperor Palpatine. Like, it was so unhelpful. And you know, also thinking about how, like, if a protagonist from, you know, a protagonist from like a backwater is suddenly like elevated into the center of like imperial power, that person is not likely going to be able to affect change. Like, the most likely outcome is that they end up like co-opted into the system. And I think I'm appreciative of science fiction and fantasy that is like attentive to the realities of these power structures and how they actually operate. Just on a slight tangent, just about like the way that these, I guess, North-South dynamics have been depicted in science fiction and fantasy world building. So I was thinking a little bit in preparation for this panel about like the era of like classic or golden age science fiction, like post World War II, because that was actually the period of time when the global South, you know, eventually and gradually became constructed, right? Like the post-colonial countries then become the non-aligned movement, and then eventually post-1988 kind of become the global South. So I was looking at a lot of like 1960s science fiction and thinking about like how galactic empire is so prevalent, you know, from writers like Isaac Asimov to Frank Herbert. And I was wondering, like, maybe the fixation for these like post-World War II American science fiction writers, their fixation with galactic empire was maybe a way of like avoiding confronting presently existing neocolonialism. Like, oh, these like galactic empires are like ancient and degraded. They're like old European empires. Like, oh, we've got nothing to look at here with like, you know, predatory trade treaties. Of course, like stories about empire are probably a lot more exciting than stories about trade treaties, but they don't need to be that way. I mean, The Trader Baru Comrade by Seth Dickinson is a very exciting novel about economics and trade treaties. And I sense if I keep talking, I'm going to begin rambling, so I will leave it there.
Awesome. Thank you, Manish. We've got about 6 minutes left. Let's take a look at a couple of questions from our audience. And if we could just like, just only respond if you have something to say, and try to make it quick. We're asked, does grappling with historical violence become a way of avoiding attention to current practices and economic interests? Which is kind of like what you were just saying, Manish, about the, looking at the crumbling empire rather than facing what's going on right now. Do you think that is this a trend, even in the present with science fiction and fantasy writers from the West?
Well, I think it could be also a tool because some people kind of when they read, they need to have some detachment from just writing straight up about reality. So we can very effectively use historical parallels to depict what's happening now without calling names, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's a great.
Yeah, and there's an argument to be made that by perpetuating these structures in different worlds, you are saying this is inevitable. So just lie back and take it. Yeah, so that can be bad.
Sorry, I just wanted to add also, so history tends to repeat itself a lot and we tend to forget. So, and these reminders are very important. And again, like pandemics, it happened 100 years ago, exactly. And nobody took any lessons from it today. So
yeah, no, I think that's the trick, right? Is finding the parallels and trying to use them in speculative ways to warn about the present and to maybe dream of a better future. Here's a question about a specific work. Is Le Guin's The Dispossessed a North-South representation or something yet different? Anybody have an opinion on that?
I think she's on record as saying that she was thinking quite a bit about Eastern expressions of socialism more than North-South directly. But she was, so interested in the world that it's hard to imagine that she wasn't thinking about the global South in a sense too, about poorer countries and that the concern for areas of deprivation just permeates her work. So I think it was probably both of those. That'd be my capsule answer, I guess.
Cool.
Great work. Fabulous read.
Oh yeah, it is amazing. And a lot of her work is really prescient. And she's one of the writers that I think gets this right a lot more than she gets it wrong, right? In the Discord chat, they've been having a conversation about our conversation on the various manifestations of geodirectional bias, whether it's north or south or east versus west or wrong side of the tracks and stuff like that. And they are seeing, like we are, this family resemblance. And some of them find that, terrifying, but others are like, well, but that's also reassuring because doesn't that mean that there's a single mechanism or dynamic that's just, scalable and removable in times, but it is, oppressor and oppressed or something like that. And doesn't that make it a little bit easier to conceptualize solutions to the problem rather than having 10 different problems?
No. Modern history is littered with the ruins of people thinking that you can transpose one solution from one context to another. The solutions, I feel strongly, are very, very context dependent. And yes, there are broad truths of, those who work and those who don't, and, all sorts of the basic levels, but just saying, we can take this model and transpose it in our search for solutions to another place. International development has failed over and over and over because people thought they could do that.
Yeah, not taking into account like cultural specifics and geographic specifics and historical specifics of a country. Yeah, I mean, I think of the issues facing Mexico versus South American countries or countries in Africa or whatever. There's the population in Mexico, both indigenous and mixed and white, are the dynamics are different and the interplay is different. But yeah, I mean, there are lessons that you can learn, and it seems smart to look at the interplay in different similar situations. But I think I agree with you that the solution's got to be specific. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
I have one quick, slightly related thing I want to say, and that is just that mapping is never a neutral technology. Cartography was, you know, a key imperial technology, and there's always an agenda. And I think, yeah, learning about like indigenous like mapping systems has been really like fascinating to me. And yeah.
Awesome. And Manish will have to have the final word because our time is done. Thank you so much, Anna, Manish, Robert, Carl, and all of you watching. I hope that the rest of your Readercon is delightful. Buenos días, que les vaya muy bien.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Please join us afterwards. Conversation can continue in the Hallway Chat 1 channel on Discord. And I have a little bit of a write-up where I'm going to post all the questions if people want that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.